Hello and welcome to another Python tutorial. So, I got a fun video today. I think it's fun. What we're going to do in today's video is we're going to basically continue this whole discussion of how we can integrate Excel VBA with Python, but we're going to see how we can make Python API request from an Excel workbook using Python and then simply dump that information into the workbook real time. So ideally what this would look like, at least kind of in its final product, and it's going to take a couple videos to do it, but basically we could create a function in Python or a script in Python that we could then call from Excel VBA that would then request information from an API and then simply populate a spreadsheet for us. So this is again adding certain new functionality to Excel that we could potentially do with VBA. I mean, there's nothing really stopping us from doing it, but it's just hard to do it in VBA because a lot of the built-in objects in VBA really aren't designed super well for using APIs, whereas Python is a little bit more robust and it's easier to and a little bit more user friendly to do these API requests. So we're going to see a lot of good benefits of doing it in Python vice VBA. However, I will say we're going to cover what people might consider a little bit more on the complicated topics. So for some of you VBA users out there who are just kind of getting started doing some of the Python stuff, we're going to be covering some, just more, I would say, advanced topics, things like recursion, things like list comprehension. I will say this, I'm going to do my best to explain it. These certain topics, you just have to practice it. It's just one of those things you're probably not going to get it the first time. Do it over again. I would say like 5 or 10 times, it'll start sticking. But if you first look at it and you're like, I have no idea how that works, I'm really not getting it, don't beat yourself up over it. A lot of these ideas, it took me a long time to get it. I mean, probably longer than most. So, just bear with me. It might seem confusing at first, but again, just bear with me. It'll get easier. Okay, so with that being said, let's get started. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to import our libraries like every other video. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to import the win32com.client object. And then from here, we're going to import the request library. So this will allow us to make URL requests using Python. And then our win32com client object will allow us to plug in to our Windows API to control the VBA object model. Now that we've done that, we're going to get the active instance of Excel. And so we want to be able to refer to this active instance of Excel later in our script. So we're going to store it in a variable. And then we're going to take that variable and we'll call it later in our code. So we'll call our variable Excel app. And it will be equal to win32com.client.get active object. And then we're going to pass through a string called Excel.application. And then just for sanity purposes, we'll call our Excel app. We can clearly see it called correctly. So now we have a reference to the Excel application. I'm happy. We should all be happy. Let's insert a cell below this little section down here. This is where we're going to be making our request to YouTube. So we're going to be using the YouTube API. I'm not going to go into a lot of details of how it works and all this and that. I have a whole video dedicated to that. So if you're really curious, I encourage you to watch that video. I will put a link down below. But again, I'm not going to be going into a ton of detail or else the video is going to be way too long. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to define our API key. Like any good API request, we have some kind of mode of authentication. We'll store it in a variable called API key. And then this API key actually currently exists in my Excel workbook. However, you can't see it. It's on the sheet 2 and it's in a particular cell. You need to keep your API key private. That's not something you share. And then we're going to call the Excel app. We're going to call the workbooks collection. We're currently working in the first workbook. And then we're going to call the worksheets collection. The cell that I'm looking for is on sheet 2. Now that I have the worksheet, I'm going to call the cell that I want. It's in range A1. And then I want the value that is associated with that cell. Now, I'm not going to print it out, but just for sanity purposes, just to make sure there's no errors or anything like that, I'll put in an A2. We didn't get any errors, so we'll just assume at this point that it's stored in this variable called API key. Now that we've done that, we're going to define our final URL, so basically our endpoint to go and make our request, and then we're going to go define our parameters of our search. Now, I already have this stuff populated. I don't want to type it out again because I'll probably make a typo and then there will be an error or something like that. So I'm just going to copy it from my previous example. It's right up here. And then I'm going to copy this, put it over here, but I will go over it. So the first thing is we have a variable called final URL. This is simply the URL of our API. And all we're doing is we're going to go into the Google API. We're going to go to YouTube, version 3, and then the particular endpoint that I'm using from the YouTube API is the playlist items endpoint. This particular endpoint does take a couple parameters. We want to be able to pass these parameters through our URL. And so when we call the get method that belongs to our request library, there is a parameter that we can pass through. It's called params, and it takes a dictionary object. And this dictionary object contains all the parameters and their associated values that we want to pass through in our particular request. Now, in my example, we have 4 different parameters. The first one is part. This defines the different components of my little playlist that I want. This is basically, hey, give me the details, give me more details, and then tell me if the video is active or not. The next one is the max result. This is just saying, hey, I want the 5 results. And then this one is saying, hey, which playlist do you want? I want this one. And then the API key is simply the key. So you have to pass through your API key when you do make a request. Now that we've done that, we can make a request to the URL. So we'll make a request to the URL, or really to the API. We'll say make a request to the YouTube API, and then we're going to store that response. So when we make a request, we're expecting something back. I'm going to store whatever is sent back to me in a new variable called response. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call the request library. We're going to call the get method, and then we're going to define 2 parameters. The first one is the URL. Well, that's simply the final URL. This is basically the API that I want to call. And then the params parameter, that's kind of a mouthful, is simply what is the dictionary that I'm going to pass along with my URL. So these are kind of basically filling in the extra components of my API request. Well, that is simply equal to my parameters dictionary. And then when I get something back, it's going to be a JSON string. JSON strings are horrible to work with in Python if you don't decode them. It's a string. It's literally a string object. So what we're going to do is we're going to decode our JSON string, which will turn it into a Python dictionary. So we're going to decode our JSON string. And what we're going to do is we're going to store that decoded response in a new variable. And we're going to call it decoded response. And that will equal our response variable. But then we're going to call the JSON method, which will then decode the response for us. And then from here, we see that we get our information back. Now, here's the problem. Yes, I could potentially dump it into Excel spreadsheet, but it's going to look really nasty. It's not going to look right. The biggest problem that we're running into is we have a nested dictionary. More particular, if you look right here, I'm really concerned with this items section because this contains all the different videos, right? Well, I don't like the fact that we have these nested dictionaries because I'm going to have to know the keys for them, and then I'm going to have to know how many times I need to either maybe loop through them. I have to know the values to those one. I wish there was a generalized way that I could simply call a function and it would basically flatten it for me. By flatten, what I mean is I don't have these nested dictionaries. I just simply have one dictionary that has a key and a value associated for each item in that dictionary. So the goal when I'm flattening it is I'm removing these nested dictionaries, and if there's a nested list, I'm removing those as well too. Now, we can do this. We can build a function that will do this for us, but it requires this idea of recursion. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say recursion is the easiest concept to grasp at first, but I'm going to try to do my best to explain it. Ideally, when you kind of see it in action, it's going to hopefully solidify the idea. But I will say this, if you don't get it, don't beat yourself up over it. It took me like 20 or 50 times of like looking at it and then playing around with it really to understand the concept. So if you're looking at this and you're like, I still don't get it, don't beat yourself up. The general idea with recursion is that we can break down a particular problem into smaller components. Now, what I mean by smaller components is, in our particular situation, our problem is that we have this nested dictionary. And we need to break it down into components that we can handle. So I don't want to have to deal with nested dictionaries. I just want to have to deal with individual dictionaries or list. If it's an individual dictionary or list, I can handle that. I can just simply loop through it. I can create a key or something like that. And then I can take that final result and I can put it into a list or something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new function. And we're going to call this function flatten JSON. Well, from the name, hopefully you can guess what we're trying to do. We're trying to flatten our JSON file. This will take a parameter. We'll just define it very arbitrary. We'll call it y at this point. Now, ideally, what this flatten JSON function is going to do is it's going to create a new dictionary for me that will be flattened. So it's not going to have any of these nested lists or these nested dictionaries. So ideally, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new dictionary called out, and then it will turn this out dictionary, which is flattened, back to me once it's done what it's done. Now, in order to do this, though, we're going to have an inner function that exists in our outer function. So this is our outer function, and we're going to have a new function inside of it called flatten. And this is really where all the heavy lifting is going to be done. And this particular function is going to take two parameters. The first one is going to be called x, and then it's going to take a second parameter called name. Now, I'll explain kind of what name is in a second, but at this point, just know that we have two parameters. Now, this particular object right here, this is the fun part, because basically what we're going to do is we're going to loop through our JSON response, and we're going to ask a question each time. We're going to say, is the object that I'm dealing with a list? Is it a dictionary? Or is it just simply a regular object, so a key and a value? Well, if it's a dictionary, it basically means I need to break it down further. I need to break it down to the component where it's just a key and a value. If it's a list, I need to break it down to its individual elements. I don't need a nested list. And then finally, if it's neither one of those, it means it's at its smallest component possible, and so it's no longer nested. I can simply store that final product in my final dictionary. So let's deal with the first case. The first case is if the type of object that I'm dealing with, if it's a dictionary, we need to handle that dictionary. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each key in our dictionary, and we're going to pass through that key through our flatten object. Well, really not necessarily our key, but we're going to pass through the value. So we're going to call our dictionary object, we're going to pass through the value, and then what we're going to do is we're going to define the second component of our dictionary, which is simply the name. So the previous name that we had, well, at this point, it's nothing, but then it's going to be the key value plus an underscore. What this will do is it will make sure that our keys are unique. So as we go deeper and deeper into our dictionary, we're going to always have a unique key. That's important because dictionaries have to have unique keys. You cannot have the same key for a dictionary or it's going to replace that value. So this little section right here is creating our unique key. It's taking our previous name, adding the key value to it, and then an underscore to it. That's all. In the other case is we don't have a dictionary, but we have a list. So if the type is a list, if it's a list, then in this one, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to loop through our list. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to define an initializer. This is going to be used to define our quote-unquote key. And what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each element in my list, and I'm going to pass through each element back in to my flatten function. And again, I'm going to pass through the old name plus the string. So basically plus the initializer, because again, this is helping us create our unique key. And then I'm going to pass through an underscore, so that way as it grows, we have these underscores kind of dividing each section. So it's not this kind of glob of letters that's kind of hard to read. And then from here, I need to basically grow my initializer. So I need to increment it and go to the next one. So I need to add 1 to it. In our final case, it's not a list, it's not a dictionary. It must mean it's at its lowest possible value. So it's just an individual key value pair or something like that, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say out. There we go. Out. So our out dictionary, we need a key for our out dictionary. Well, simply take the name that was given to you and then take the last element in that list and then set it equal to X. So that will be your value. Well, sorry. What this one's doing is it's removing that last underscore if there is one. So it's basically removing that last underscore. It's a little hard to kind of explain it if you see it. So take this function, put it in there, and literally print out each little section. It'll make a little bit more sense, but basically it's just removing, if there's this last underscore, it's removing it. That's all it's doing. And then it's simply saying, okay, take that out dictionary, add the new key, and then add the value that's associated with that. So now that we've defined our flatten function, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, call the flatten function on the object that is passed through our flatten JSON function, and then return the out dictionary. So basically return the flatten dictionary. Hopefully this made sense. If it didn't, don't beat yourself up over it. But the idea with recursion is I'm passing through this object. So this outer function's taking a JSON string. I'm going to pass through that JSON string, or sorry, that JSON object through my flatten function. And I'm going to ask a question on each basically iteration of my particular, on my particular item in my object. And that it basically is it a dictionary? If it's a list, or it's at its lowest element. If it's a dictionary, it means it can be broken down further. So pass it back through the flatten function and try to break it down further. If it's a list, it means it can be broken down further. So loop through that list and then pass through each element in that flatten function. If it's neither one, so if it's not a dictionary, it's not a list, it means it's at its lowest possible breakdown. So simply add that lowest possible breakdown to our dictionary, have the key be the name, and then have the value be that lowest level element. So hopefully that made sense. I'm sorry if that was confusing. That was not my goal. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to flatten our dictionary. So we're going to flatten the dictionary that was basically our decoded response. And so we're going to store it in a new variable called my items. But here's the thing. Where is it? Decoded response. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the items section, right? The items section has multiple videos. So I have to go through each individual video and flatten it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten each video, and I want to store the flattened results in a list. So I want basically a list of flattened dictionaries. This is a great example of how we can use list comprehension. So with list comprehension, what I can say is, hey, for each video in the decoded response, and then pass through the items key. So the items section is basically all my videos. I'm saying for each video in my decoded response, simply flatten that video. That's it. And then from here, let's see what we get, okay? The idea with here, all I'm doing is I'm creating a list, but I'm looping over some other list, and then I'm applying some kind of function, or I'm doing something to that list or to each element in that list or that group. So now what I have is I have a list of flattened dictionaries. So here's the first dictionary that's been flattened. Here's the second dictionary that's been flattened. Can't speak tonight. The third dictionary that's been flattened. The fourth dictionary that's been flattened. And then finally, our fifth dictionary that's been flattened. So again, all we've done is we've created a list of flattened dictionaries. That's all. Now, there's something else that I need to do. I need to create a list of column headers. I want my column headers to simply be the keys in my flattened dictionary. Now, I only need to do this for one of the dictionaries, but I need to store all those keys in a list. So I'm going to do, again, list comprehension, which is basically meaning I'm just going to loop through a list and then store those values in a list. And then what I can do is I can then call this list of column headers and then simply set them equal to a range of cells. For performance purposes, I like to have them in a list already. Now, I could use a for loop, but I'm going to push you guys a little bit, and we're going to use list comprehension. So we're going to create a list of column headers. And so this one will be called column headers. This will equal, and then again, for key value in my item, so the flattened, basically the list of flattened dictionaries, I just want the first flattened dictionary, and then I want the keys from that flattened dictionary. So for each key in the first flattened dictionary, basically just store them in a list. And that's all. And then from here, just for sanity's sake, we can now see that we have a list of all the column headers. Hopefully that made sense. Again, list comprehension. I'm creating a list basically with a for loop, and then I'm saying, hey, what am I doing to each element in this particular for loop? And then whatever I do to each particular element, store that output in a final list. Okay, so now that I've done that, I can at least populate my header row. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to define my header section and then populate it. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to define the worksheet all this information is going to live on. And so that's obviously the first part. So the first thing is we're going to define the worksheet. And so we're going to create a new variable called worksheet. We'll call the Excel app object. We'll go into the workbooks collection, take the first workbook, and then we'll call the worksheets collection, and then we'll pass through sheet 1. So we have our worksheet, and then from here, we'll define the the header section, and then populate it. So define the header section and populate it. Okay. So we're going to do a start cell. This is the first cell in our header section. This will equal the worksheet object, and it will be cell row 1, column 1, or A1. Row 1, column 1. The end cell, which might be a little bit hard to think about at first. Again, we're going to go in the worksheet object. We're going to go to the cells collection or object. And then we're going to say, hey, it's still the first row. But here's the fun part. Well, what column do we want it to be? Well, we just basically want it to be the length of my list, right? Because that contains all my column headers. So as long as it's the length of my list, I'm good, right? Sounds good to me. So what we'll do is we'll simply pass through the length of our column headers list. So we'll call the len function, which returns the length. And then this will say, hey, the last cell in my range is simply row 1, and then whatever this is. So it's dynamic. It will change as my API request change. And then from here, I can populate it. So I'll call my worksheet object. I'll call the range property, pass through the start cell, and then I'll pass through the end cell. I'll set the value property equal to the column headers. I'll snap this over here. This one. Perfect. Okay. So as you can tell, it populated our header for us. So it did a lot of the heavy lifting. And again, everything looks good. I'm happy. Let's move on to the next section. Okay, so now that we've done that, now we have to deal with the actual row values, right? Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create the proper structure. So that way we can just simply call the value property and then set that equal to basically our row values, right? So again, unfortunately, we're going to use list comprehension. So we're going to get the row values. And even in this example, it's going to be a little bit more complicated, but nothing too crazy. We'll create a new variable, call it row values. And again, we'll do list comprehension. And I'll say, hey, for each video in my items, what I want you to do is I want you to create a list, and then I want you to create a nested list. And then what I want you to do is I'm going to say for each list of values in each video.values, have that be part of the list. So all this is doing is it's creating a nested list using list comprehension. For each video in my video list, for each value in my video, simply store that value in this list. If I print this out, let's see what we get. Ba-ba-bum. Okay, so we have this outer list, and then we have this inner list. This is the first inner list, second inner list, third, fourth, and then our fifth and final list. So we have a list within a list, a nested list. It's kind of funny, right? It's funny, we tried flattening it because we didn't want it like that. Now we just put it back into something that we would go like, oh, this is horrible. We don't want to deal with it. But this is for performance reasons. There is kind of a slowdown that if we have to loop through each individual cell, it can take a little bit longer. Again, most of the time, it's not an issue if you're talking about 2 or 3 requests or even 20 requests. It's not going to be that big of a deal. But you start getting into the large data sets, you can definitely see performance implications. So I want to teach you guys the right way, and I want to make sure you know the right way to do it, so that way you're not kind of getting lost when you're doing it. So now that we have row values, we need to basically do what we did up here, which is we need to define the section that we need to populate. And so we're going to define the row section. That's just what we'll call it. So we need the start cell. Well, this is simply going to be on the worksheet that we're currently on. We're going to go into the cells property. We're going to start at row 2, not row 1, because row 1 has the column headers. Row 2, but column 1. And then we need to define our ending cell, which is simply equal to our worksheet object. Again, the cells, but this one. Start at row 1, and then simply count down the length of our row values list. And so this is going to return back 5. So there's 5 lists within our nested list. So 1 plus 5 is 6. So this should be the last one, right? Makes sense. So 2 to 6. That looks like 5 to me. So I'm happy. And then we need to define how far we need to go out to the right. So how many columns? Well, we can simply take the method that we used up above, which is take the length of the column header list. That worked fine before. I don't see why it shouldn't work right now. Okay, and then from here, we can populate the row values. Now we're going to break it into 2 parts. The first part is we're just going to simply populate it. But because we're dealing with such long strings, it automatically wraps the text by default. And so for readability purposes, I'm going to set that equal to false. But I'll explain kind of how to do that. So first thing, we're going to go in our worksheet object. We're going to call the range property. We're going to define our start cell and then our end cell. We're going to define the value property, and then we're going to define the row values. Again, we're going to go in the worksheet object. We're going to call the range property because now we've populated it. Take the end cell, take the value property, not the value property, the wrap text property, and we're going to set that equal to false. Okay, so let me snap this over here. Again, we're expecting all this information to be right around there, right? Bam. So as we can see, it populated it for us. But more importantly, it was really quick. I did this with regular loops. It wasn't a big deal. I mean, it still was fast in certain terms, but this is much faster. So I encourage you guys. I know it might be a little bit harder because you've got to define a starting cell and an ending cell. You've got to make sure it's dynamic. But for performance purposes, it does seem to be the faster route at this point. So, I'm just going to kind of encourage you guys to keep going that direction. But with that being said, that does conclude today's video. Sorry for it being a little bit longer, but that's just kind of the nature of the topic. If you have any questions about what we covered today, please make sure to put them down in the comments below. Or if you just have general comments, please put those down as well too. Also, if you could make sure to like the video, we appreciate the support. We want to make sure other people can find it. And so when you guys like it, it makes it a little bit easier to find. So we appreciate when you guys do that. And then also, if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So there is going to be a part 2 to this. We're going to see how we can leverage the Excel workbook to kind of make it a little bit more user-friendly, where you can put in some parameters, we'll go make the request for you, and then dump the data where you want it to be dumped. So I think that'll be fun. I think that will hopefully give you guys some good ideas of, kind of how to integrate, again, Python with this whole VBA aspect. So thanks again for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next video.